Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will learn how to create our own brand new, completely custom REST API URL. Now, before we learn how to do this, let's first go over why we would do this. So we know that there are these REST API URLs like this. For example, this one will display JSON data for the 10 most recent blog posts. Or we could go to /pages, or we could go to /media, or /users. You get the idea. There are all sorts of built-in WordPress REST API URLs that will let you fetch just about any data that you're looking for. And also, instead of just posts and pages, we could also try to visit a custom post type. So for example, professor. Now, by default, a custom post type will not be included in the REST API. So that's why we see an error message here. However, in order to get the professor post type to show up in the REST API, we are just one simple change away. So check this out. Right now, in your text editor, instead of your theme folder, I want you to open up the MU Must Use Plugins folder. And within MU Plugins, let's jump into our University Post Types file. Right? This is the file where we register different post types. Let's scroll down to professors, or I should say singular professor without an S. And all we need to do is add a property within this associative array. So maybe right before this supports line, the ordering doesn't matter, but let's say show in REST and just set it to equal true. Okay, now as soon as we save this, now we can indeed receive raw JSON data for the 10 most recently created professors. Now at this point, you might be wondering, if it's that easy to include custom post types in the REST API, if that's all it took, then why would we bother creating our own brand new API URLs? Right? Why don't we just use this API URL? Well, let me give you a real-world example. So in our search overlay, we don't only want to search for posts and pages. So if I search for biology, I also want to see a link to the biology program, and also I want to see professors that teach biology. And I also want to see any campuses where biology is taught. And finally, I also want to see any upcoming events that are related to biology. However, WordPress's built-in search logic is not very advanced. And so sometimes we need to take matters into our own hands. Let me show you what I mean. Back at this REST API URL for the professor post type, if we add on at the very end, $search equals, then we can enter any keyword that we want to search for. So for example, I know that I have a professor named Dr. Barks a lot. So if I say search equals Barks a lot, the search is successful, and now we only see the JSON data for that one post for the Dr. Barks a lot professor. However, if instead of Barks a lot, I search for biology, then we see 0 results. And this can be confusing at first because we know that we have professors that teach biology, right? If I go onto my website and click on programs and then biology, we know that we have 2 biology professors, right? Dr. Barks a lot, Dr. Meows a lot. Now, the reason those professors are not showing up when I run this search is because the native WordPress search logic only searches within really obvious fields, like the title field and the main body content field. WordPress doesn't know to search within our custom fields, and even if it did, it wouldn't know how to interpret the relationships that we set up between different post types, right? Like between a program and a professor, or a program and a campus. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that if we create our own brand new, completely custom API URL, well then we can do whatever we want, and we can code our own new custom search logic. Logic that will indeed be aware of relationships between different posts and post types. Okay, now before we get started and begin coding our new custom API URL, Before we get into that, I want to go over the 4 main reasons of why we're doing this. So number 1 out of 4 is what we just talked about. We need our own custom search logic. Reason number 2 is so we can customize things to send back way less raw JSON data. Because the default WordPress API URLs, they send back literally everything about a post. It gives us the date. It gives us the actual body content field. Just a whole bunch of stuff, when really, in terms of our search overlay, all we really need is the title, a permalink, and in the case of professors, maybe a URL to a thumbnail image. Now that would be way less data to send back, which means the search would load faster for our visitors, especially if someone was on a slow mobile connection. Reason number 3 is so that our front-end JavaScript can just send one single GetJSON request instead of 6. Right, because the default API URLs, they only return a single post type at a time. Right, you've got one URL for posts, another for pages, another for professors. Whereas if we code our own new API URL, we can search and work with all 6 post types at once. So that can speed things up a bit as well. And finally, reason number 4 is that this is quite literally the perfect exercise to sharpen our PHP skills. The act of trying to search for just the right data and then needing to format the data into just the right structure, that's the perfect recipe for strengthening your PHP skills. It's going to be a tremendous learning experience. So without further ado, let's get started. The first step is to jump into your text editor, and for the time being, we can forget about the MU plugins folder, and let's jump back to our theme folder. Okay, within the theme folder, open up functions.php. Now we could just start writing all of the new code right here within this file, but a bit of a spoiler alert, we are going to be writing a good amount of code. And I don't want our functions.php file to become huge and unmaintainable. So a good way to stay organized is to create a brand new separate file, and then we can just include or require in that file right here. Technically, you could create the new file anywhere within your theme folder, but just to stay organized, why don't we create a new subfolder named includes? Or we could even just name it INC for short. The name of the folder does not matter, it's just personal preference. So if I right-click on the theme folder and choose new folder, and give it a name of INC for includes, feel free to name it whatever you want, but then within that new subfolder, let's create a new file. And for now, let's just open up PHP. That's all we need for now. Let's save this file. And the name of this file definitely does not matter. But just to make sense, I'm going to name it search-route.php. Cool, so now we've got our new subfolder, and that's where the new file lives. Now back in functions.php, up at the top here, let's just write a new line of code that pulls in or requires in that separate file. So to do that, we can just say require, and then a space, and then there's a WordPress function named getThemeFilePath. And for the argument, we can just say quotes, / and then look inside the INC subfolder, and then just type out the name of your brand new separate file. So for me, that's search-route.php. Okay, let's go ahead and save this functions PHP file. And really quick, I just want to stress the fact that you do not need to do this in order to create a custom REST API URL. This has nothing to do with the task at hand. This is just a general tip for staying organized. If you wanted to, you could break down each one of these current functions we've written into its own separate file. Right? You could have one for this, another one for our page banner function, and then you could just have several of these require in lines. It's totally up to you, but let's get back to the task at hand. So now let's jump into that brand new separate file that we just created, search-route, and the first thing we want to do is add an action. So the WordPress function, add action. For the first argument, we just list the WordPress event that we want to hook onto. we've already used this once, and that is REST API init. And then the second argument is a function that we want to run at that moment. We can make up any function name we want, but why don't we go with university register search. I just made up this name. There's nothing magical about it. Now let's go ahead and create a function with this exact name. So we can say function and then match that name. So university register search, parentheses, curly brackets. And now within the body of this function, this is where the naming does need to be specific. There is a WordPress function named register rest route. And this function takes 3 arguments. So just as a placeholder, let's say A, B, C. The first argument is the namespace that you want to use. But what does that mean? What in the world is a namespace? Well, remember our goal is that we want to create a new REST API URL. Now, if we look at this default API URL for the professor post type, the namespace of this URL is WP. And WP indicates that this is a default part of the core of WordPress. So when we are coding, we don't want to use the WP namespace because we are likely not working on the core of WordPress. We are working on our own custom features, right? Probably either a theme or a plugin. So back in our code, for our namespace, why don't we just say university? You want to choose a name that's fairly unique so that you won't run into any conflicts with plugins. Okay, now the second argument is the route. So what is a route? Well, in this case, of this API URL for the professor post type, in this instance, the word professor is the route. Or if we go back to posts, now the word posts is the route, right? So the route is the ending part of the URL. It's the specific thing that you want to do. So for our route, why don't we say search? Okay, now before we move on and talk about the third argument, I want to answer a question you might have right now. Because back in the address bar, you might be wondering, well, what is the v2? If this is the namespace and this is the route, where does version 2 come into play? Well, technically, that's just part of the namespace. It's always a good idea to include v1 or v2, so that way if anyone else was using your API and you make huge changes to it, instead of pulling the rug out from underneath someone's feet, if you need to make huge changes, you can just bump this up to v3 or v4. So that way, once other people start depending on and using your API, you never really change any of the existing URLs. You can just add a new version if necessary. So long story short, the version number is just part of the namespace. So as a good practice, within our name of university, within these quotes, we could just add on a /v1, right? Because this is the first version of what we are building. All right, now let's talk about the third argument. This is where we simply supply an array that describes what should happen when someone visits this URL. So within the parentheses for this array, let's drop down just to stay organized. And now we just build out an associative array. The first name that we want to target is methods. So let's just set that to a temporary X placeholder. And the other name that we want to target is callback. So when we see the word methods, I want you to think of the CRUD acronym. Remember CRUD, which stood for create, read, update, and delete. Or in other words, when someone visits this URL, what are they trying to do? Well, in our case, they're just trying to load or read data. And the technical way of doing that is by sending a GET request. So instead of this placeholder, let's say quotes GET. Now, this value of GET will almost always work. But if you want to go the extra mile and make sure that your code will work on every web host out there, instead of quotes GET, we can say WP REST server : readable. And this is just a WordPress constant that's basically just going to substitute it for a value of GET. But depending on the type of web host you're using, it might use a slightly different value instead of GET. So this is the safest way of doing things. Okay, and then finally, let's address callback. We want to set this to a function And then whatever this function returns is the JSON data that will be displayed. So instead of this placeholder, let's just make up a function name. It could be anything. Why don't we call it University Search Results? Okay, and now our final step is to just create a function with this exact name. So down at the very bottom, let's just say function, then match that name. So University Search Results, parentheses, curly brackets. And now just as a test, let's return a string of text that says, congratulations, you created a route. And then at the very end, include a semicolon. All right, now let's go ahead and save this file and jump over to the browser and test out our new URL. So up in the address bar, after the root of your WordPress install, let's add on /wp-json. And then instead of /wp, we use our new namespace, which was university. And remember, we said university/v1, then a slash, and then just the name of our route, which we named search. Perfect. Congratulations, you created a route. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will learn how to do something actually useful here, right? And return real WordPress content and raw JSON data instead of this placeholder message. It should be a lot of fun. Let's keep it rolling, and I'll see you then.